The wagon wheel hit the rock, and Esther Prescott felt herself flying sideways into empty air before strong hands locked around her waist and yanked her back against a solid chest.
Easy now. I got you.
The stranger's voice rumbled against her shoulder blade as he steadied her on the bouncing seat, his grip firm and warm through the thin cotton of her work dress. She twisted to look up at him and found herself staring into hazel eyes shadowed by the brim of a tan cowboy hat, a face all sharp angles and sun-bronzed skin, maybe 27 years old, and handsome enough to make her forget she'd sworn off men entirely after last spring's disaster. It was late spring in 1869, the wildflowers blooming purple and gold across the Texas Panhandle, and Esther had been driving supplies back to her ranch outside Coyote Gulch when this stranger had ridden up alongside her wagon and warned her the ford ahead was sabotaged.
Who are you, and why should I believe you?
She pulled free of his hands and grabbed the reins, slowing the horses to a walk as they approached the river crossing.
Name's Amos Garrett. Used to ride with the Caldwell gang until I decided going straight beat hanging. And you should believe me, because I just saw Rathbone Ashford's men upstream breaking the levee to flood this crossing.
Esther's stomach dropped at the name. Ashford was the brand inspector who'd been circling her ranch like a vulture ever since her father died, claiming water rights that would ruin every rancher in the valley and force them to sell out before the railroad route got announced.
Ashford never raises his voice, and he's never wrong, which means if he's sabotaging the river, he's already 3 steps ahead.
Then we better get 4 steps ahead of him.
Amos swung down from his bay horse and waded into the ford, testing the depth with a long stick, while Esther watched the ridgeline for riders. The water was rising fast, brown and churning, already knee-deep where it should have been shallow.
We can make it if we go now, but the wagon's going to struggle. You drive, and I'll ride alongside to keep the horses steady.
I can handle my own team.
Didn't say you couldn't. But when that current hits the wheels, you're going to need someone who can swim.
She hated that he was right. She snapped the reins, and the horses plunged into the ford, water spraying up around the wheels as the current grabbed at the wagon bed. Amos rode close, one hand on her lead horse's bridle, his voice low and calm as he kept them moving forward. Halfway across, the riverbed dropped, and the wagon lurched sideways, back wheels sinking into soft sand.
We're stuck.
Not yet. We're not.
He dismounted in one smooth motion and waded back to the wheel, bracing his shoulder against the spokes.
When I push, you whip those horses hard. Don't stop even if you think you're clear.
Esther didn't hesitate. She cracked the reins and shouted, and the horses lunged forward as Amos heaved against the wheel with a grunt of effort that made the muscles in his back strain against his faded blue work shirt. The wagon broke free with a sucking sound and rolled forward into shallower water, and she risked a glance back to see Amos knee-deep in the current, grinning like he'd just won a hand of poker. Then she heard the horses coming fast from the ridge. 3 riders crested the hill and started down toward the ford at a gallop, dust rising behind them in a long plume. Esther didn't need to see their faces to know they worked for Ashford.
Go! Go now!
Amos grabbed his horse's reins and vaulted into the saddle, spurring alongside her as she whipped the team into a run. The wagon hit the far bank hard enough to rattle her teeth, and they were racing up the dirt road toward Coyote Gulch, the riders gaining fast behind them.
They're going to catch us before we reach town.
Not if we don't let them. There's a cutoff through the canyon about a mile ahead. Can you handle the wagon on rough ground?
Can you handle not asking stupid questions?
His laugh was quick and surprised, and she felt an answering flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. They hit the canyon trail at full speed, and the wagon bounced over ruts and stones, supplies sliding in the bed behind her. Amos rode so close their legs nearly touched, his hand reaching out twice to steady the wagon rail when they hit bad patches. And each time his fingers brushed her arm, she felt the contact like a spark. The canyon walls rose high on either side, red rock striped with white, and ahead she could see the trail narrowing to barely wagon width.
When we hit the narrows, I'm going to drop back and block them. Keep going, no matter what you hear.
You'll get yourself killed.
Not planning on it.
He flashed her a reckless grin that made her pulse skip, and then he was reining his horse back, wheeling to face the oncoming riders. Esther wanted to stop, wanted to turn around and help him. But she'd grown up on this land, and she knew better than to waste a man's courage by throwing it away. She drove hard through the narrows and didn't look back until she heard the crack of gunfire echo off the canyon walls. Her heart seized in her chest. She hauled on the reins so hard the horses nearly sat down, the wagon skidding to a stop in a cloud of dust. For 3 endless seconds, she heard nothing but her own ragged breathing and the creak of leather. Then hoofbeats, coming fast, and Amos burst through the canyon bend with his hat gone, and a wild grin splitting his face.
Told you, I wasn't planning on dying today.
He pulled up alongside the wagon, and she saw the shallow graze across his upper arm, where a bullet had clipped him, blood seeping through the torn fabric of his shirt.
You're bleeding.
Just a scratch. Seen worse from tangling with barbed wire.
Get down here and let me wrap it before you pass out and fall off that horse.
Yes, ma'am.
He dismounted, and she climbed down from the wagon seat, her hands shaking as she tore a strip from her petticoat and wrapped it tight around his arm. His skin was warm under her fingers, and she could feel his pulse beating strong and steady.
You're good at this.
Had to be. My father got hurt more times than I can count before he died last winter.
Her voice caught on the words, and Amos went very still, his free hand coming up to cover hers, where it rested on the bandage.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. Help me figure out how to stop Ashford before he ruins everyone else, the way he tried to ruin us.
She looked up and found his face inches from hers, close enough to see the gold flecks in his hazel eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his sun-warmed skin. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, a horse whinnied in the distance, and they both jerked back, the spell broken.
We should keep moving. They'll find another way around soon enough.
Esther nodded and climbed back onto the wagon, trying to ignore the way her hands still tingled where they touched him. They drove into Coyote Gulch as the sun slanted long and gold across the settlement's dusty main street, past the general store and the saloon and the little white church at the end of the road. Esther pulled up in front of the land office and tied off the reins.
If Ashford's been forging deeds like you said, there'll be proof in the records.
And if the clerk's in his pocket?
Then, we'll find another way.
She marched up the steps with Amos right behind her, his presence solid and reassuring at her back. The land office was dim and cool after the bright heat outside, and the clerk looked up from his desk with a startled expression that told Esther everything she needed to know.
I need to see the water rights filings for the Prescott Ranch and the 5 properties bordering it.
The clerk's eyes slid past her to Amos, and his face went pale.
You heard the lady.
The clerk stood so fast his chair scraped backward, and he fumbled with a ring of keys, hands shaking as he unlocked the file cabinet. Esther pulled out the thick folder of deeds and spread them across the desk, her heart sinking as she scanned the documents. Every single one had been altered. Dates changed, signatures forged, all transferring water rights to a holding company that she knew without checking was owned by Rathbone Ashford.
This is enough to hang him.
Only if we can get it to the new territorial judge, before Ashford knows we have it.
A floorboard creaked behind them. Esther spun and saw the clerk bolting for the back door. Amos was faster. He caught the man by the collar and hauled him back, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed maps.
Where's Ashford right now?
The clerk whimpered, and Amos leaned in closer.
I asked you a question.
The man's voice came out in a terrified squeak that Esther barely heard, because at that moment she caught the sound of heavy silver spurs clinking in the hallway outside. Her blood went cold.
Amos.
He turned, and his hand dropped to the revolver on his hip as the door swung open, and Rathbone Ashford stepped inside. He was a tall man, lean and elegant in a black suit and silver brocade vest, his dark hair slicked back, and his pale eyes cold as January ice. Those heavy silver spurs gleamed at his heels, each step a soft metallic chime that made Esther's skin crawl.
Ashford.
The villain smiled, a thin, precise expression that never reached his eyes. His voice when he spoke was quiet and cultured, each word clipped and precise. He told them they were trespassing, and that the documents were legal, and that if they knew what was good for them, they would leave town immediately. Esther's hands clenched into fists.
We know about the water rights scheme. We know you've been forging deeds and sabotaging the river to force families to sell.
Ashford's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered in his pale eyes. He said very calmly that he had no idea what she was talking about, and that he would be happy to discuss it with the sheriff when the man returned from his rounds.
The sheriff who works for you?
Ashford's spurs clinked as he shifted his weight, the sound like a snake's rattle in the silence. He said nothing for a long moment, just looked at them with that calculating gaze. And Esther knew with cold certainty that he was already 3 steps ahead, already planning how to deal with them. Then his hand moved toward his coat, and Amos drew his revolver in one smooth motion.
Don't.
Ashford froze. His voice stayed calm and level as he told them that violence would only prove their guilt, but Esther saw the way his fingers twitched toward his inside pocket, and she knew he was armed.
We're taking these documents to the judge.
Ashford's laugh was soft and utterly devoid of humor. He said the territorial judge had disappeared 3 days ago and no one knew where he'd gone.
Convenient.
Ashford shrugged one elegant shoulder and said that fortune favored the prepared. Then he stepped aside with a gracious gesture and told them they were free to leave any time they wished. Esther grabbed the folder of deeds and backed toward the door with Amos covering her retreat, his revolver never wavering from Ashford's chest. They made it to the wagon, and Amos climbed up beside her, his leg pressed against hers on the narrow bench seat as she snapped the reins and sent the horses racing down the street.
He's going to kill us.
Only if he catches us. Where's the nearest town with a federal marshal?
Amarillo. 2 days hard ride.
Then that's where we're going.
They drove out of Coyote Gulch as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. And behind them Esther heard the clinking of silver spurs as Ashford stepped onto the boardwalk and watched them go. They camped that night in a dry wash 10 miles from town. No fire, because the smoke would give them away. Amos hobbled the horses while Esther spread bedrolls on the hard ground, her whole body aching from the long drive. The stars overhead were so thick and bright, they seemed close enough to touch, and the night air was warm and still. carrying the scent of sage and dust.
You should eat something.
He handed her a piece of jerky and a canteen, and sat down close enough that their shoulders brushed. Esther took a small bite and forced herself to swallow, even though her stomach was tied in knots.
Tell me about the Caldwell gang.
Not much to tell. I was young and stupid, and thought robbing stagecoaches was easier than breaking horses. Took me getting shot, and left for dead, to realize I was wrong.
What changed?
Woke up in a missionary's house with a hole in my side, and a choice to make. She told me God gives second chances, but not third ones. Figured I better listen.
His voice was quiet and matter-of-fact. No trace of self-pity or pride, and Esther found herself believing him. She turned her head and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the starlight.
Why did you help me today?
Because Ashford's been destroying good people for profit, and someone had to stop him. And because when I rode up and saw you fighting to keep that wagon steady, I thought you were the bravest damn thing I'd ever seen.
Heat flooded her cheeks, and she looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs.
I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn.
Same thing out here.
His hand found hers in the darkness, and his fingers laced through hers, rough and warm and steady. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, and Esther felt something inside her chest crack open, just a little, letting in light for the first time since her father died. Then Amos stiffened, and his hand tightened on hers.
Someone's coming.
She heard it a moment later, the soft thud of hoofbeats on packed earth, coming from the direction of town. Amos was on his feet in an instant, pulling her up with him and shoving her behind a screen of scrub brush.
Stay down and stay quiet.
He drew his revolver and moved to the edge of the wash, his body tense and ready. Esther crouched in the shadows with her heart in her throat and watched as 3 riders appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the stars. For a moment they sat motionless, scanning the terrain, and then one of them pointed down toward the wash, and they started descending.
They found us.
Not yet, they haven't. Come on.
He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the horses, moving fast and silent. They mounted in one smooth motion, Esther swinging up behind him on his bay because it was faster than hitching the wagon. And then they were racing across the open desert, with the riders closing in behind them. The night air rushed past her face, and she wrapped her arms around Amos's waist, pressing close against his back, feeling the hard muscle and bone of him solid and real beneath her hands. He leaned low over the horse's neck, and she bent with him, her cheek against his shoulder blade, and she felt his free hand come back to cover hers where it rested against his ribs.
Hold on tight.
She did. They rode hard through a landscape of shadows and silver starlight, dodging between boulders and leaping dry creek beds, and slowly the sound of pursuit faded behind them. When Amos finally reined in, they were miles from the wash, standing on a high ridge with the whole panhandle spread out below them like a dark ocean. Esther slid down from the horse on shaking legs, and Amos dismounted beside her, his hand going to the small of her back to steady her.
We can't keep running. He'll just send more men.
I know. Which is why we're not going to Amarillo.
What?
We're going to the county fair in Red Creek tomorrow. Ashford will be there for the livestock judging, because he never misses a chance to show off. And that's where we're going to corner him and make him confess in front of witnesses.
That's insane.
You have a better idea?
She didn't. She looked up at him and saw the starlight caught in his eyes and the determined set of his jaw, and she realized she trusted him completely. Trusted him in a way she'd never trusted anyone except her father.
All right. We'll do it your way. But if we die, I'm going to be extremely upset with you.
Fair enough.
He grinned, and then his hand came up to cup her cheek, and she went very still, barely breathing as he leaned in close. His breath was warm against her lips, and for a heartbeat she thought he was going to kiss her. Then the horse snorted and shied sideways, and the moment shattered. Amos stepped back with a rueful laugh, and Esther let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding.
We should get some sleep. Big day tomorrow.
They made a cold camp on the ridge and lay down side by side on a single bedroll because they'd left the other one in the wash. Esther tried to keep space between them, but the bedroll was narrow, and every time she shifted, she ended up pressed against his side, feeling the warmth of him seeping through her clothes.
This is ridiculous.
Could be worse.
How?
Could be raining.
She laughed despite herself and felt him smile in the darkness. His arm came around her shoulders, and she let herself relax against him, her head tucked into the curve of his neck.
Amos?
Yeah?
Thank you. For everything.
Thank me when we're still alive tomorrow.
His voice was soft and drowsy, and she felt his breathing slow and deepen as he fell asleep. She lay awake longer, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear and watching the stars wheel overhead. And somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, she realized she'd fallen in love with him. They rode into Red Creek at mid-morning, with the sun already fierce and white in a cloudless sky. The county fair was in full swing, tents and wagons crowding the main street, livestock penned in makeshift corrals, and crowds of families moving between the contests and exhibitions. Esther could smell roasting corn and frying dough, and the sharp tang of animals and sweat.
There.
Amos pointed toward the livestock arena, where a crowd had gathered around the judging platform. Esther saw Ashford standing beside the auctioneer, immaculate in his black suit despite the heat, those heavy silver spurs gleaming as he moved.
How do we get him to confess?
We don't. We get him angry enough to make a mistake.
Amos swung down from the horse and helped Esther dismount, his hand steady on her waist. Then he pulled the folder of forged deeds from his saddlebag and handed it to her.
When I give the signal, you start reading those deeds out loud. All the names, all the forgeries. Make sure everyone hears.
What are you going to do?
Make him chase me.
Before she could protest, he was striding toward the platform, shouldering through the crowd with the kind of reckless confidence that made her heart seize in her chest. She saw him reach the front and step up onto the platform beside Ashford, saw the villain's pale eyes widen in recognition and then narrow in calculation. Amos said something she couldn't hear, and Ashford's face went absolutely still. Then, Amos grabbed the auctioneer's speaking trumpet, and his voice boomed across the fairground.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement. The man standing beside me has been forging water rights deeds and sabotaging river crossings to steal land from honest ranchers.
The crowd gasped and surged forward. Ashford's hand moved toward his coat, but Amos was faster, grabbing his wrist and twisting it back. For a moment they stood frozen in a silent struggle, and then Ashford wrenched free and bolted off the platform, running toward the maze of tents and wagons, with Amos right behind him. Esther didn't hesitate. She jumped onto the platform and grabbed the speaking trumpet.
Listen to me. Rathbone Ashford forged deeds for the Prescott Ranch. The Miller homestead, the Chen property, the Sullivan water rights, and the Morrison grazing lands. He's been stealing from all of you.
She held up the folder, and the crowd roared, some in anger, some in shock. Then, she heard a crash and a shout from the direction of the tents, and she dropped the trumpet and ran. She found Amos and Ashford locked in combat behind the livestock pens, grappling in the dust while onlookers scattered. Ashford was stronger than he looked, wiry and vicious, and he had a knife in his hand. Esther screamed a warning, and Amos twisted sideways as the blade slashed past his ribs. Then, Amos's fist connected with Ashford's jaw, and the villain went down hard, the knife spinning away into the dirt.
Stay down.
Ashford laughed, a cold, terrible sound, and his voice when he spoke was no longer quiet and cultured, but raw with fury. He shouted that they were fools, that he owned this territory, that no one would believe a failed rancher and a washed-up outlaw over him.
They already do.
Esther held up the folder, and Ashford's eyes went wide as he saw the crowd gathering behind her, dozens of faces angry and accusing. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not toward the street, but toward the parked wagons and tents. Amos swore and took off after him with Esther right on his heels. They chased him through the maze of canvas and rope, dodging between startled families and leaping over tent stakes. Ashford was fast and desperate, and he knew the fairgrounds better than they did. He vaulted over a wagon tongue, and Esther tried to follow, but her boot caught, and she went sprawling forward with a yelp. Amos skidded to a stop and hauled her upright, his hands gentle despite the urgency.
You all right?
I'm fine, go!
But Amos didn't let go. He pulled her close for half a second, his forehead touching hers, and his voice was rough and fierce.
Don't scare me like that.
Then he was running again, and Esther was running with him, her hand locked in his. They burst out of the tent maze just in time to see Ashford vault onto a horse and spur toward the edge of town. Amos whistled sharp, and his bay came trotting over, and they mounted together, Esther swinging up behind him like they'd done it 100 times before. The chase led out of Red Creek and across open rangeland, the horses' hooves pounding in rhythm with Esther's racing heart. Ashford's mount was faster, but Amos knew how to ride, and he cut the angle on every turn, gaining ground steadily. They were closing in when Ashford's horse stumbled on a gopher hole and went down hard, throwing the rider clear. Ashford rolled to his feet and drew a small derringer from his vest, his face twisted with rage.
Get down!
Amos pulled the horse into a sliding stop and shoved Esther sideways as the derringer cracked. She felt the bullet whip past her ear, and then Amos was firing back, and Ashford was diving behind a tangle of scrub brush. Esther hit the ground and scrambled toward cover, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. Amos was beside her a moment later, reloading with quick, practiced movements.
This ends now. Stay here.
Not a chance.
She grabbed his arm, and he looked at her with exasperation, and something that might have been pride.
You're impossible.
You're welcome.
They circled wide, keeping low, until they could see Ashford crouched behind the brush, with his derringer trained on the spot where they'd been. Amos made a quick hand signal, and Esther nodded. She picked up a rock and threw it hard to the left, and Ashford spun toward the sound. Amos lunged from the other side and tackled him before he could turn back, slamming him face down into the dirt and wrenching the derringer from his grip.
It's over, Ashford.
The villain lay still for a moment, breathing hard, and then he started laughing again. That same cold, terrible sound. He said the judge was dead, and the sheriff was bought, and no court would convict him.
Then, it's a good thing we don't need a court.
She held up the folder again, and this time, Ashford saw the crowd of ranchers and townsfolk who had followed them from the fair. 50 people who'd heard his confession and seen him try to kill them. His laughter died, and his face went ashen. Amos hauled him upright, and someone in the crowd produced a length of rope. They tied Ashford's hands behind his back and marched him toward Red Creek, with the whole town following like a solemn parade. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, the sun was hanging low and painting everything gold and orange. The sheriff took one look at the crowd and the folder and Ashford's pale, terrified face and locked him in a cell without a word. Esther stood on the board sidewalk afterward, her knees shaking with relief and exhaustion. Amos stepped close and put his hand on the small of her back, steadying her.
You did it.
We did it.
He smiled, and she smiled back, and for a moment the world was just the two of them, and the warm evening light. Then someone called out that they should come back to the fair and celebrate, and the spell broke. They walked back through town side by side, not quite touching, but aware of every inch of distance between them. The fairground was still alive, with music and laughter, and the smell of fried dough and roasted corn. Amos bought her a cup of cold lemonade, and they sat on a bench at the edge of the crowd, watching children chase each other, and couples dance under strings of paper lanterns.
What happens now?
We go home. Fix the fences. Plant the crops. Hope for rain.
And us?
He looked at her, and his expression was serious and tender all at once.
I don't know. What do you want to happen?
I want you to stay.
I'm not going anywhere.
Promise?
Promise.
She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her waist, and they sat like that until the stars came out, and the music faded, and the fairground emptied. Then they mounted the bay together and rode home through the dark, with the warm night air wrapped around them like a blanket. When they reached the ranch, the moon was high and silver, and the house looked peaceful in its glow. Amos helped her down and held her hand a moment longer than necessary.
Good night, Esther.
Good night, Amos.
She started toward the house, and then stopped and turned back.
Actually, would you help me with something?
Now?
Now.
She led him into the kitchen and lit a lamp and pulled out a sack of flour and a bowl and a jar of honey.
What are we doing?
Making bread for tomorrow. I promised the Harrisons I'd bring some when we go to return their wagon.
You want to bake bread at midnight?
I want company.
He grinned and rolled up his sleeves, and they worked side by side, measuring and mixing and kneading the dough on the scarred wooden table. Flour dusted the air and settled on their clothes, and somehow ended up on Esther's nose. Amos reached over to brush it off, and his thumb lingered on her cheek, and she caught his wrist, holding him there.
Thank you. For everything.
You don't have to thank me.
I do. You could have left a dozen times, and you stayed.
I stayed because I wanted to. Because you're stubborn and brave, and you make me laugh, and you don't give up.
She pulled him closer, and he cupped her face in his flour-dusted hands and kissed her, slow and gentle and sure. She kissed him back, and the world narrowed to the warmth of his mouth and the solid strength of his arms and the sweet honey smell of the dough rising on the table. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless and smiling.
So what now?
Now, we let the dough rise.
I meant us.
I know what you meant.
She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her waist, and they stood like that in the lamplight, swaying slightly, perfectly still.
I want you to stay. Not just tonight. Not just until the roundup. I want you to stay, for good.
Are you asking me to marry you?
Maybe. Would you say yes?
Maybe.
She laughed and swatted his chest, and he caught her hand and kissed her knuckles.
Yes. I'd say yes.
Then ask me properly.
Esther Prescott, will you marry me?
Yes.
He kissed her again, and this time it was deeper and longer and full of promise. When they pulled apart, his eyes were bright, and hers were damp, and they were both grinning like fools.
When?
After the roundup. Something simple. Just us. And the preacher. And maybe a few friends.
Sounds perfect.
They finished the bread together, shaping the dough into loaves and setting them in pans to bake in the morning. Then, Amos walked her to the foot of the stairs and kissed her one more time, soft and lingering.
Sleep well.
You too.
She climbed the stairs and paused at the top to look back. He was still standing there, watching her, and the look on his face made her heart turn over. She waved, and he waved back, and then she slipped into her room and closed the door. Downstairs, she heard him banking the fire and checking the locks, and then his boots on the boards as he headed to the barn. She lay in bed with the window open and the warm night breeze stirring the curtains, and she thought about everything that had happened and everything that was coming, and she smiled into the dark. Tomorrow, they would return the wagon and tell the Harrisons the good news. The day after that, they would start fixing the fences and planting the crops. And in a few weeks, after the roundup, they would stand in front of the preacher and make it official. She closed her eyes and let herself imagine it. Amos in a clean shirt, with his hair combed, and his eyes steady on hers. Her in a simple dress with wildflowers in her hair. The two of them speaking the words that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. It felt right. It felt like home. She drifted off to sleep with a smile on her lips and Amos's name in her heart. And outside the moon sailed high and silver over Coyote Gulch. And the night was warm and full of stars. Morning came bright and hot. The sun climbing fast over the horizon and turning the sky from pink to pale blue. Esther woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Amos moving around downstairs. She dressed quickly and hurried down to find him at the stove, flipping bacon in the skillet with one hand and pouring coffee with the other. He looked up when she came in, and his smile was wide and easy.
Morning.
Morning. You didn't have to cook.
I wanted to. Besides, you made the bread.
She looked at the counter where the loaves sat golden and perfect, and her chest swelled with quiet pride. They ate together at the table, passing plates and talking about the day ahead. The plan was simple. Return the wagon to the Harrisons, then ride into Red Creek to check on Ashford and make sure the ranchers were organizing properly. After that, they would come back and start on the fences. It felt good to have a plan. It felt even better to have someone to make plans with. They finished breakfast and cleaned up together, working in comfortable rhythm, and then they hitched the team and loaded the empty wagon. The ride to the Harrison place took an hour, the road winding through scrubland and over low ridges. The morning was already getting warm, and the dust hung in the air behind them. When they reached the Harrison ranch, the family came out to meet them, and Esther could see the worry in their faces. She climbed down and told them everything. Ashford arrested, the water rights secured, the ranchers banding together. Mrs. Harrison started crying, and Mr. Harrison shook Amos's hand so hard Esther thought his arm might come off. Their oldest son clapped Amos on the back and said he was a hero. Amos looked uncomfortable with the praise, but Esther squeezed his hand and he relaxed. They stayed for another hour, drinking lemonade on the porch and talking about the future. The Harrisons were planning to expand their herd now that the water was safe, and they asked Amos for advice on stock and grazing. He gave it freely, his voice calm and sure, and Esther watched him with a quiet glow of pride. When they finally left, the sun was high, and the heat was pressing down like a weight. They took the road back toward Red Creek, moving at a steady pace. Halfway there, Amos pulled the wagon off the trail and stopped under a stand of cottonwoods near a dry creek bed.
We need to rest the horses.
And ourselves.
They climbed down, and Amos unhitched the team and led them into the shade. Esther sat on the tailgate and fanned herself with her hat, watching him work. He moved with easy confidence, his hands sure on the harness, his shoulders flexing under the thin fabric of his shirt. She felt a flutter of warmth that had nothing to do with the heat. When he finished, he came and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched.
Hot.
Very.
We could stay here a while.
We should get to town.
We will. After we rest.
He leaned back on his elbows, and she did the same, their bodies angled together in the dappled shade. The silence was comfortable and full of unspoken things. After a few minutes, Amos reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together.
I've been thinking.
About what?
About the wedding. What if we did it sooner?
How soon?
Next week.
She turned to look at him, and his eyes were serious.
The roundup isn't for 3 more weeks.
I know, but I don't want to wait that long. Do you?
She thought about it, her heart beating faster. The truth was, she didn't want to wait either. She wanted to be his wife, now, today, this minute. But there was so much to do, so much to plan.
What about the ranch?
We'll manage. We always do.
What about the preacher?
I'll ride into Red Creek today and talk to him. We can do it simple, just like you said. No fuss.
She looked at him and saw the hope and certainty in his face, and she felt her hesitation crumble.
Next week.
Next week.
He grinned and pulled her close and kissed her, and she kissed him back with all the yes in her heart. They stayed in the shade a little longer, talking about details, laughing at the absurdity of planning a wedding in a week. Then, they hitched the team again and drove the rest of the way to Red Creek. The town was buzzing when they arrived. People gathered in clusters on the street, talking in low, excited voices. Esther and Amos tied off the wagon and walked toward the sheriff's office. Inside, they found the deputy behind the desk, looking tired and overwhelmed. He said Ashford was locked up tight, and the circuit judge would be through in 2 weeks. The ranchers had already filed a formal complaint, and half the town had signed witness statements. Ashford's operation was finished. Esther felt a fierce satisfaction at that. They left the office and walked down the street, stopping to talk with people they knew. Everyone wanted to shake their hands and thank them. It was embarrassing and wonderful all at once. They stopped at the general store to pick up supplies, and while Esther was choosing flour and sugar, Amos slipped away. She found him a few minutes later at the jeweler's counter, talking to the shopkeeper in a low voice.
What are you doing?
Nothing.
But he was smiling, and the jeweler was smiling, and Esther's heart did a little flip. She didn't press. They finished their shopping and loaded the wagon and headed for the church at the edge of town. The preacher was a kind-faced man in his 50s, and he listened to their request with a warm smile.
We'd like to be married. Next Saturday, if you're available.
The preacher looked from Amos to Esther and back again, and his smile widened. He said he would be honored. They talked for a few minutes about the ceremony, simple vows, no fuss, just the two of them and a few friends. When they left the church, Esther felt light as air. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the sun slanting low and painting everything gold. The air was cooler now, and a light breeze stirred the dust. They talked the whole way, planning and dreaming, their voices mingling in the warm air. When they reached the ranch, Amos unhitched the team and turned the horses into the corral while Esther carried the supplies inside. She was putting away the flour when he came in, his face flushed from the heat and his eyes bright.
I have something for you.
What?
He pulled a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. She opened it, and inside was a simple gold ring, thin and delicate, with a tiny blue stone set in the band. Her breath caught.
Amos.
It's not much, but I wanted you to have it now. Not next week. Now.
She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet.
It's perfect.
He took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger, and it fit like it was made for her. She stared at it, her vision blurring, and then she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard. He laughed against her mouth and lifted her off her feet, spinning her once before setting her down.
So it's official?
It's official.
They spent the evening together, cooking supper and eating on the porch as the sun set and the sky turned purple and pink. The air was warm, and the night was full of cricket song and the smell of sage. They sat close together on the porch steps, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they watched the stars come out one by one.
I never thought I'd have this.
Have what?
A home. Someone to share it with. A reason to stay.
You have it now.
I know.
He kissed the top of her head, and she closed her eyes and let herself sink into the moment. The warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart, and the certainty that this was where she belonged. They stayed like that until the moon rose, and then Amos walked her to the door and kissed her goodnight, long and slow and full of promise.
1 more week.
1 more week.
She went inside and climbed the stairs, her heart so full it ached. She stood at the window and looked out at the ranch, the barn and the corral and the wide, dark land beyond. And she thought about how much had changed in just a few days. A week ago, she'd been alone and desperate, facing ruin with no way out. Now, she had a partner, a plan, and a future brighter than anything she dared to imagine. She touched the ring on her finger and smiled. Downstairs, she heard Amos banking the fire and checking the locks, and then his footsteps crossing the yard to the barn. She lay down and closed her eyes, and sleep came easy and sweet, full of dreams of wildflowers and vows, and a simple gold ring that promised forever. Morning came with birdsong and golden light streaming through the window. Esther woke with a smile already on her lips, dressed quickly in a clean work dress, and hurried downstairs. The smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted her, and she found Amos in the kitchen, standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up and his hair still damp from washing. He turned when she came in, and his face lit up.
Morning.
Morning. You didn't have to cook.
I wanted to. Besides, you did all the work yesterday.
She crossed to him, and he pulled her close, kissing her softly. Then they ate together at the little table, making plans for the day. The fences needed mending, and the water troughs needed cleaning, and there were a dozen other tasks that had been waiting too long. They worked side by side all morning, Esther holding posts while Amos hammered them into place. Both of them sweating under the warm sun, but laughing and talking the whole time. Around midday, they took a break in the shade of the barn, passing a canteen back and forth, and catching their breath.
You know what I was thinking?
What?
We should plant a garden. Vegetables. Maybe some flowers for the house.
I'd like that.
And we could fix up the barn loft. Make it a proper storage space, instead of just a pile of junk.
And paint the shutters. They're peeling.
And build a chicken coop. Fresh eggs every morning.
She laughed and leaned against him, her shoulder brushing his.
We're going to be busy.
Good. I like busy.
They went back to work, and the afternoon passed in a blur of hammering and sawing and hauling water. By the time the sun started to sink, they were both filthy and exhausted, and happier than either of them had been in years. They cleaned up at the pump, Amos splashing water on his face, and Esther wiping the dust from her arms, and then they went inside to make supper. This time they worked together without even needing to talk, moving around each other with easy familiarity, her chopping vegetables while he fried potatoes, both of them stealing glances and smiling when their eyes met. They ate on the porch again as the sky turned orange and pink, and afterward they sat together, watching the sunset fade to twilight.
5 more days.
5 more days.
I can't wait.
Me neither.
He took her hand and laced his fingers through hers, and they sat in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. Then he stood and pulled her to her feet, drawing her close.
Dance. With me.
There's no music.
Don't need any.
He started swaying, and she followed his lead, her arms around his neck and his hands on her waist, and they moved in slow circles on the porch, while the crickets sang and the night grew dark around them. She rested her cheek against his chest and listened to the steady thump of his heart, and she thought that this was what happiness felt like. Simple and real and so big it filled every corner of her soul. When the dance ended, he kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her lips, soft and lingering.
I love you.
I love you too.
The words hung between them, precious and true, and Esther felt tears prick her eyes. She'd never said them before, not to anyone, and hearing them said back felt like a gift she didn't deserve, but would treasure forever. They stood holding each other until the moon rose high and silver, and then Amos walked her to the door and kissed her good night one more time.
Sweet dreams.
You too.
She went upstairs and got ready for bed, her mind full of everything they'd done and everything still to come. 5 more days and they'd be married. 5 more days and he'd be hers, and she'd be his, and nothing would ever come between them again. She climbed into bed and pulled the quilt up to her chin, and she fell asleep with a smile on her face and hope in her heart. The next 4 days passed in a rhythm of work and laughter and stolen moments. They mended the last of the fences, cleaned the water troughs, and started building the chicken coop. Esther planted rows of vegetables in the garden plot, while Amos repaired the barn door. They painted the shutters together, her on the ladder, and him steadying it from below, both of them getting more paint on themselves than on the wood. Every evening they sat on the porch and watched the sunset, and every night Amos kissed her goodnight and walked back to the barn with reluctance in every step. On the 4th day, Esther rode into town to buy fabric for a new dress, something simple and pretty for the wedding. She found a bolt of cream-colored cotton with tiny blue flowers and bought enough for a dress and a shawl. The shopkeeper smiled and asked if it was for a special occasion, and Esther said yes, her wedding, and the woman congratulated her warmly. On the way home, Esther stopped at the Harrisons' place to invite them to the ceremony. Mary Harrison hugged her tight and said they wouldn't miss it for the world, and she insisted on baking a cake as a wedding gift. Esther thanked her and rode home with her heart full, thinking how strange and wonderful it was to have friends and neighbors who cared. That night, she started sewing the dress, sitting by lamplight with needle and thread, while Amos sat across from her, whittling a piece of wood into something he wouldn't let her see.
What are you making?
A surprise.
For me?
Maybe.
She smiled and went back to her sewing, and they worked in companionable silence until the lamp started to sputter. Then Amos walked her upstairs and kissed her goodnight, and Esther lay in bed thinking about the dress and the cake and the vows they'd speak in just one more day. She could hardly believe it was real. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, with a soft breeze that smelled of sage and wildflowers. Esther woke early and bathed in the tin tub, then dressed carefully in the new cream dress with the blue flowers. She pinned her hair up and tucked a handful of fresh wildflowers into the bun, yellow and purple blooms that Amos had picked for her the night before. When she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. She looked happy. She looked like a bride. Downstairs, Amos was waiting in a clean white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. He looked up when she came down the stairs, and his eyes went wide.
You're beautiful.
She blushed and took his hand.
You clean up pretty well yourself.
They rode into town together in the wagon, sitting close and holding hands the whole way. The preacher was waiting at the little church on the edge of Red Creek, along with the Harrisons and a handful of other ranchers and townsfolk who'd heard the news and wanted to witness the happy event. The ceremony was simple and quick, just the way they'd wanted. The preacher read from the Bible and asked them to speak their vows, and Amos looked into Esther's eyes and promised to love her and protect her and stand by her for the rest of his life. Esther promised the same, her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. Then the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Amos kissed her, long and sweet, and the small crowd cheered. Afterward, they all went to the Harrisons' place for cake and lemonade. Mary Harrison had outdone herself, baking a 3-layer cake with white frosting and fresh berries on top. Everyone ate and laughed and toasted the newlyweds, and Esther felt like her heart might burst from joy. When the sun started to set, Amos thanked everyone and helped Esther into the wagon, and they rode home together under a sky painted gold and pink.
How does it feel to be Mrs. Garrett?
Perfect. How does it feel to be Mr. Prescott Garrett?
I didn't take your name.
I know. I'm teasing.
He laughed and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing as he nearly tripped on the doorstep. Inside the house was warm and welcoming, the lamp already lit, and the table set with the good dishes. Amos had prepared a simple supper earlier, cold chicken and bread and fresh greens from the garden, and they ate together by lamplight, talking and smiling and stealing kisses between bites. After supper, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her waist.
I have something for you.
He pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and handed it to her. She opened it and found a carved wooden locket, smooth and polished, with a delicate flower pattern on the lid.
Amos, it's beautiful.
Open it.
She lifted the lid, and inside was a tiny lock of her own hair, tied with a blue ribbon.
So I'll always have a piece of you with me.
Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she threw her arms around him, holding him tight.
Thank you. I love it. I love you.
I love you too.
They sat together until the moon rose high, and then Amos stood and took her hand, leading her inside. He banked the fire and locked the door, and then he turned to her with love and longing in his eyes.
Ready?
Ready.
He swept her into his arms and carried her up the stairs, both of them laughing breathlessly. And when he set her down at the threshold of their bedroom, he kissed her again, deep and slow and full of promise. The door closed softly behind them, and the house settled into quiet. And outside, the Texas night was warm and full of stars, and the future stretched out before them, bright and endless, and theirs. Morning came soft and golden, the sun streaming through the bedroom window and warming the quilt where they lay tangled together. Esther woke first, her head on Amos's chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. She listened to the steady beat of his heart and felt a wave of contentment so deep it made her eyes sting. This was real. This was forever. Amos stirred and opened his eyes, smiling when he saw her watching him.
Good morning, Mrs. Garrett.
Good morning, husband.
He kissed her, slow and sweet, and they lay there for a while longer, talking softly about the day ahead. There was fencing to finish and cattle to check and a dozen other chores waiting. But neither of them was in a hurry to leave the warmth of the bed. Finally, hunger drove them downstairs, and Esther made coffee while Amos fried eggs and bacon. They ate together at the kitchen table, their knees touching, their hands finding each other between bites.
I could get used to this.
You'd better.
After breakfast, they walked out together to check the stock. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the east pasture. The horses nickered a greeting from the corral, and the whole ranch looked prosperous and full of promise. Amos squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and they stood there for a moment, just taking it all in.
We did it.
We did.
They spent the rest of the morning working side by side, mending the last stretch of fence and hauling water to the garden. The day was warm and clear, the kind of perfect late spring day that made everything feel possible. Around noon, they took a break, sitting in the shade of the barn with cool water and leftover cake from the wedding. Amos pulled her into his lap, and she leaned back against him, both of them tired and happy and covered in dust.
What do you want to do this afternoon?
I don't care as long as we do it together.
Deal.
They finished the fencing by mid-afternoon and then rode out to check the water rights markers, making sure everything was secure. The land stretched wide and golden around them, dotted with wildflowers and humming with life. When they reached the highest point, Amos reined in, and they sat together on horseback, looking out over the valley.
This is ours now. All of it.
Ours.
He leaned over and kissed her, and she kissed him back with all the love and joy she felt. And the horses shifted patiently beneath them. They rode home as the sun sank low, turning the sky shades of orange and rose. At the barn, Amos unsaddled the horses, while Esther fed the chickens and gathered eggs. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind of easy teamwork that came from trust and love. Inside the house, Esther started supper while Amos washed up, and soon the kitchen smelled of frying onions and fresh bread. They ate by lamplight again, talking about plans for the roundup, and what crops to plant in the fall, and where they might build an addition to the house someday. Every word felt like a promise, every glance like a vow. After supper, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket, even though the night was warm. The stars came out one by one, and the moon rose full and bright. And Esther rested her head on Amos's shoulder and closed her eyes.
I never want this to end.
It won't. This is just the beginning.
She smiled and turned her face up to his, and he kissed her softly, his hand cradling her cheek. They stayed like that until the night grew deep, and the crickets sang their lullabies. And then Amos carried her inside and up the stairs, both of them laughing quietly, so as not to wake the peaceful house. He set her down gently and kissed her once more, and they closed the door on the world and held each other close, knowing they had everything they'd ever need right here in each other's arms.